This week we're going to learn about the aggregate demand, aggregate supply model. And I'm going to have to move this down a little bit so that you can see the bottom of the graph. But the main point up top here is that it notes that the aggregate demand model looks like the demand curve, the aggregate demand curve does, but its downward slope is for completely different reasons. So instead of having like the income effect and the substitution effect and diminishing marginal utility, there are different reasons for this slope. So one thing that you want to understand about aggregate demand is that it represents the demand from all consumers. Okay, and all consumers include households, government, business investors, and of course, foreign purchasers. So if you look at this equation up here, this equation for aggregate demand should look really familiar because it's exactly the same as the equation for GDP. So aggregate demand is the sum of consumption, gross investment, government spending, and net exports. All right, so when you graph aggregate demand, you are going to have on the y-axis price level, right, rather than price. So price level actually represents like an index number, and it's actually going to be abbreviated PL. So it can't be price because price would imply that it's the price of just one good, and here we're talking about the prices of all goods and services, so it's going to be a number that represents the comparative level of all goods and services. So for example, the price level might be 100, okay, meaning that that's our baseline price level. And then the next year, if we have inflation, the price level might be 105, and that would represent 5% inflation. So we'll talk more about how these actual price levels or price index numbers are calculated later, but for now, just want you to understand that this y-axis represents a composite number that reflects the overall price level rather than the price of one specific good. On the x-axis, it's still Q, right? It's still quantity, but it's quantity of all goods and services. So the quantity of all goods and services in the economy is the same as the GDP or the real domestic output. So we use real GDP as the x-axis, but if you put a Q, it's not completely wrong. All right, and then we have this demand curve, and you can see it's downward sloping. Sometimes it's curved, and you can also just draw it as a straight line, so you might see it either way. It doesn't really matter, right? Technically, it's unlikely to be a totally straight line, but we're just doing a model here, so it doesn't make that much difference. So the three reasons for the downward slope of the aggregate demand curve are the real balances effect, the interest rate effect, and the foreign purchases effect. And generally, you really just need to know what they are. You don't need to know much more than that. So the real balances effect means that as the price level goes up, the value of, for example, the money that you have in a savings account actually goes down, okay? Because if the price level goes up, that means everything costs more, which means the dollars that you have actually buy less. So as the price level goes up, if we're, say, right here at this 100, right, if the price level goes up, the amount that we're actually able to buy with the money we have goes down, right? We can't buy as much because things got more expensive and our dollar doesn't go as far. So that's the real balances effect. I'm going to skip to the foreign purchases effect. Foreign purchases effect says that if our price level goes up compared to another country, say Canada, then we would be more likely to import things from Canada at their lower price and less likely to buy our own goods. So again, price level goes up, quantity of goods and services purchased within our economy will go down. And then there's the interest rate effect. And the interest rate effect basically is a multi-step effect. As the price level goes up, we need to borrow more money in order to buy big ticket items like houses and cars. And as we borrow more money, I'll write this here, this will make a lot more sense in a while when we go talk more about money. But when we borrow more money, then the demand for money goes up, and that will force interest rates to go up. And when interest rates go up, we're not able to afford as many things. When interest rates go up, for example, people are less likely to buy houses because they have to pay a higher interest rate. So that's the interest rate effect, real balances effect, and foreign purchases effect. And they are responsible for the shape of the aggregate demand curve. Now let's look at the aggregate supply curve. There's actually two different models for looking at aggregate supply. There's the Keynesian model, and there's sort of the neoclassical model. So either one shows that as, and again, you're going to have the same axes. We've got price level on the y-axis, and we've got real GDP on the x-axis. And both of these depictions, or these models, show in general that as price level goes up, output actually goes up. There's a direct relationship. The supply curve, aggregate supply curve, represents the sum of all of the supply curves for all the different producers. So it makes sense if you think about it. If everybody's producing more as prices go up, then aggregate supply will increase as prices go up. But there's slightly different opinions about what happens. If you look at the one on the left, what you see is that when we are at a really, really low output level, that we can expand output without prices going up very much. So if you think about it here, we're in a place where we're in a recession, lots of resources are being underutilized, and we can expand output without resource prices going up very much, so we wouldn't see really increase in price level. And then when we get to where resources start to become scarce, we start to see prices increase. And then we get to this, and this is sort of like the limit or the maximum GDP that our economy can produce, very similar to the concept of the PPC. And when we get there, any additional demand or any additional desire for more output, we can't make it. So what's going to happen is prices will just go up. So that's what the one on the left shows, and this is the Keynesian depiction of aggregate supply. And what John Maynard Keynes thought was that we had these three different ranges. We had this range, which is a recession, this range, which is sort of normal, and then this range, which is an inflationary range. So the one on the right is only showing right now short-run aggregate supply, and it, you'll notice, does not have ranges 1 and 3. Right? It only has this middle range where you expand output and prices go up. So classical and neoclassical economists, they don't believe that there is this range over here. They don't believe there's a point at which you could increase or decrease output without impacting prices. They think prices are always flexible, they're always changing. So they don't have that first range, and that's why. The third range, they don't have, but they do have the concept of a limit, right, or of the most output that could be produced. And this is here. You see this white line here? And they actually call this a separate line, long-run aggregate supply. Okay, and long-run aggregate supply and short-run aggregate supply are going to work together. Okay, and we're going to use both of them when we use the classical model. So really, the picture on the right isn't very different from the picture on the left, right? This is just that's their depiction of capacity, and over here we have a separate long-run curve that just means this is maximum full employment output. Okay, let's see. I think there's something else on the bottom of this slide. Okay, that's just an explanation I already gave you. So let's look at what's next. Okay, so there's things that will shift aggregate demand and things that will shift aggregate supply, and I have the aggregate demand shifters here. I'm going to go back just for a minute to aggregate demand. The things that will shift aggregate demand are anything that will shift any of the components. So anything that will shift, anything that will change consumption, anything that will change investment. So what would change consumption? People's incomes, for example. What would change investment? Interest rates. Government spending is going to change because the government decides to spend, and net exports are going to change because of exchange rates. So anything that impacts any of those elements is actually going to shift aggregate demand. So let's look at what shifts aggregate supply. Aggregate supply shifters include resource and factor prices, productivity, and the legal institutional environment. So if overall resources like oil or water, something essential like that, become cheaper, then we will see aggregate supply shift to the right. Okay? If those resources become more expensive, we'll see aggregate supply shift to the left. Productivity, more productive we are, the same thing, productivity, right? Think about if we have new capital, it makes us more efficient. Our PPF, right, is going to shift outward, and our supply curve is also going to shift to the right. Legal institutional environment means things like corruption, for example. If there's greater corruption in a government, that's going to actually shift aggregate supply to the left because a lot of money is going to be wasted paying bribes rather than producing goods and services. Okay, so we put them together. This is the macroeconomic short-run equilibrium. And what we've done is we've just put aggregate supply and aggregate demand together, and we have an equilibrium position, which is shown at this price index level of 100 and a GDP of 510, presumably billion, right? So that's just a picture right there of what happens, and you can see what will happen then in this economy. So we have a price level, we have an output level, an increase in aggregate supply due to new technology, for example, right, would cause us to end up with a higher GDP and a lower price level, right? So what if we had something like an increase in corruption and all this money was going to bribes? Well, then we would have aggregate supply would shift to the left. Okay, this could also happen because of increased resource prices, and we would end up with a higher price level and a lower output level, right? So the shifts are a lot like the regular shifts of supply and demand, but they have different impacts because they're impacting the overall price level and the GDP for the country. So we'll get more into that in the next couple of sessions. Okay, so the classical economists and the Keynesian economists have a disagreement about what happens when aggregate demand falls. And aggregate demand can fall for a variety of reasons, but think back to the circular flow model. If households feel poorer, maybe because the value of their retirement accounts went down or the value of their houses went down, they stop spending and aggregate demand drops. Right? That's going to throw the economy into a recession. And the Keynesian economists said, well, what's going to happen is we have something they refer to as sticky wages and prices, that range one, right, of their aggregate demand curve, their aggregate supply curve. What's going to happen is if there is this range one, then a decrease in demand is going to decrease output, but it's not going to actually impact prices. Right? So this is what Keynesians think happens. When demand falls, output falls, but prices don't. This is going to be really important later. The classical economists say that's not true. When demand falls, output falls, and prices fall. Okay, so they have a slightly different picture of what's going to happen, and that will have a different impact on whether the economy is able to correct itself in the long run. All right, the macroeconomic long run looks like this. We're using the classical or neoclassical view now rather than the Keynesian. It's really not very different. I will draw the Keynesian one for you. But you can see that the long run equilibrium position, basically this is long run aggregate supply. This is the capacity for an economy, and right now supply and demand intersect at that point. Anything else is not going to be an equilibrium position, because if demand goes up, you can see we have some inflation, we have short run, we're going to have some increased output, but this is not sustainable because we're actually producing beyond full employment. It's like producing outside of your PPC, right? That's not an equilibrium position. You won't be able to do it for very long. Okay? You'll exhaust your resources. So similarly, this is not a long-run equilibrium position, right? Because you have a lot of unused resources, and that's going to cause downward pressure on prices. So a long-run equilibrium position looks like a giant asterisk. All right, just one more slide for this week. Is a big overview of this model, and that is some of the things that can cause us to fall temporarily out of equilibrium. So anything that's a leakage can actually cause us to temporarily leave equilibrium. So taxes are money that leaves the circular flow and goes to the government. So when people pay taxes, if that is not replaced by, and you can see at the bottom here, government spending, right? If the government collects taxes and doesn't spend money, then that would actually be money that leaves the circular flow, doesn't become part of aggregate demand, and that would cause demand to shift left. So leakages can be a problem. If people save, okay, all these things are going to cause consumption to go down. Consumption goes down, aggregate demand shifts left, okay, GDP goes down, and we are no longer at full employment equilibrium. So if people are saving more, if people are paying more in taxes, or if people are buying more imported goods, any of those things can cause a decrease in consumption and aggregate demand and cause GDP to go down. However, these injections can balance them out. So if people are saving, but if that money becomes available for businesses to invest in, they borrow and invest it, then investment goes up, and then we don't have a problem. So if investment goes up and aggregate demand goes up, then we no longer have this GDP decrease problem. And if we're buying imports, but people are buying our exports again, it can balance out. So all of the ones in the bottom, okay, are the ways in which other factors can balance out those leakages. So ultimately, to be at long-run equilibrium, leakages and injections have to be equal. The sum of taxes plus savings plus imports has to equal the sum of government spending plus investment plus exports. And that is the conclusion of the video for this week.